I'm going to tell a story, and by chance it's also going to cover a Central African area called South Sudan, but I'll explain that as we go on. I'm going to tell a story about a young boy called Mun. Ambrose Paré was a French military surgeon in the 16th century, and he's remembered for the rather humble quote, "I dressed his wounds, but God healed him." One day after a battle, the medical team had run out of the boiling oil that they used for cauterizing wounds. So he made up his own ointment using egg white, oil of roses, and turpentine. Cauterization was being done to stop bleeding and to prevent infection. Of course, this was centuries before antibiotics. The following morning, he was very pleased that all the patients he'd treated had slept well, though the cases who'd been treated with boiling oil had been in pain all night. He's highly regarded as one of the pioneers of battlefield medicine, as was a much later also French surgeon. And this was Dominique Larrey. So he was Napoleon's main surgeon for his army. And Larrey was an early proponent of triage, which prioritizes treating the sick as first. And this is now widely practiced. He also developed the first ever ambulance service to carry casualties from the battlefield to be treated. With this history, it seems only appropriate that it was indeed French doctors and journalists who set up MSF, and that was as a result of another war, the Biafran War in Nigeria in the late 1960s. So my story concerns a young boy, Mun, who was transferred to Bentiu Hospital, which is run by MSF in the northern South Sudan. Now, South Sudan is the world's newest country, being established in 2011 after a successful referendum in the Sudan, which at that time was Africa's largest country. Since the end of colonization in 1956, when Sudan gained its independence, there had been frequent fighting between the Islamic North and the animist and Christian South. It's slightly ironic that Sudan is now in the news again with internal fighting. But in the new country of South Sudan, unfortunately, there's been ongoing conflict between the two biggest ethnic groups. That's the Dinka and the Nuer, and that's been going on for generations. Now, due to the large numbers of people affected by the fighting, they're made to leave their homes, which were being burnt, and many graduated to the Bentiu area, which is in northern South Sudan, such that the UN then opened a POC camp. Now, what's POC? Protection of Civilians Camp. And the camp there's got a similar population to that of Cambridge. So it's a big camp. The casualties from the fighting and to look after the people in the camp is why MSF equipped the Bentiu Hospital, particularly with a surgical service as well, which is why I was going there. Before I continue my story about Mun, I wanted to let you know about my own African experience, which started much earlier. It started as a result of a lecture I'd attended at medical school in 1970. Yes, 1970. That would have a major impact on my life later on. The lecture was by an orthopedic surgeon who described an event when he was working at a new medical school and hospital in Ibadan in Nigeria. During colonization, few sub-Saharan African countries had medical schools. To qualify in medicine, students would have to go abroad, mainly to Europe, and of course they didn't always return. With independence, which was achieved mainly in the 1950s and 60s, all these countries recognized their need to open their own medical schools. However, few had enough qualified local staff and employed a lot of foreign doctors, including the orthopedic surgeon who was giving the lecture. Now, he described a young boy who was admitted with tetanus. Now, tetanus causes severe muscle spasms and eventually will stop people from breathing, so people die with it. At the time, the new hospital didn't yet have any anesthetic machines. They had anesthetic drugs, They had breathing masks, they had throat tubes, but they didn't have an anesthetic machine. So this orthopedic surgeon organized the medical students into teams and actually had them hand ventilating this boy round the clock. I can't remember how many days it was for, but the boy survived. And I thought, wow, that's the sort of place I could go and do my elective. An elective period is what many medical schools allow, where you can go away and do something that particularly interests you. And in Birmingham, where I was training, this was before the start of our final year. What I experienced in Nigeria and the remarkable people I met left a lasting impression and made me want to work in Africa at some stage in my life. But forging a career in surgery and a growing family meant this was put on hold for a long time. In fact, a very long time. So to come back to Mun, he'd presented with severe abdominal pains at another MSF project and was suspected of having peritonitis. The Bentiu hospital was the only one with a surgical service for several hundred miles. Most MSF projects do not have a surgical service, so surgical patients need to be transferred. And in South Sudan, this usually means by plane. This inevitably takes some time to organize and was only possible the following day. When Mun arrived, he was really very ill, with clear signs of peritonitis. Peritonitis is a medical emergency, and unless adequately treated, would prove fatal. We actually suspected typhoid rather than something simpler like appendicitis because he was so unwell. And in fact, at surgery, he had multiple perforations, that's little holes in his distal small bowel which were leaking intestinal contents into his abdomen. And this is typical of typhoid. So carefully repaired these, washed out the abdominal cavity, and he was given the appropriate antibiotics. If I can just give you a little historical note. Typhoid is now regarded as mainly a tropical disease, but back in time it was endemic wherever sewage could contaminate water supplies. And in fact, our own Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort, is known to have died of typhoid. To come back to Mun, unfortunately, a few days after the surgery, he developed a fistula, which was a leak from one of the repaired typhoid perforations. And the small bowel contents were leaking through the wound. Fortunately, it was not accumulating inside, because obviously that would prove rapidly fatal. He was not eating, he was very unhappy, and he was starting to waste away. This is because in the absence of nutrition, the body cannibalizes its own muscles, and I'm sure you've all seen pictures of people who are starving where the ribs stand out, and that was just how it was for him. And in fact, I took a picture of him, which I will not show, which I show to medical students and training doctors just to emphasize how severe that can be. Now, you might wonder why we didn't reoperate then. The problem was that if the bowel hadn't healed after the first operation, with his very poor nutritional state, it was never going to heal after the second. So we continued to support him with nutritional supplements, but were not making any progress. Now, at this stage, my assignment in Bentiu ended, and I handed over to the next surgeon and returned home. I should point out that surgeons tend to have relatively short assignments because they're usually single-handed and are continuously on duty, so no time off. The surgeon who replaced me kept me updated by email, and I was very saddened to hear that Mun was being transferred back to the referral centre for palliative care. So I presumed he would not survive. Henry Marsh, a London surgeon who wrote a remarkable book called Do No Harm, said that all surgeons have failures. In particular, he wrote that surgeons keep the memories of these failures in their own private graveyards. Now I'm going to jump forward 6 months when I went to Malawi for an MSF-run ultrasound training course. One of the other participants there was a Canadian surgeon, also called John, who I'd overlapped with briefly on a previous assignment. He'd recently come back from working at Bentiu, and he showed me a remarkable photograph that he'd been sent when he was there. It had been taken at the MSF project that we'd originally sent Mun back to, and for what was expected to be palliative care. The photograph we'll show later will show Mun looking remarkably well nourished, standing there with his arm raised, doing a Nelson Mandela type salute. So Mun had recovered well. But if you look at the photograph, you will see protruding from below his T-shirt a little stoma bag, a colostomy bag. So clearly his small bowel fistula had not healed. By chance, I was scheduled to go back to Bentiu a couple of months later. When I got there, I was able to organise for Mun to be transferred back and prepared to operate on him. I was anticipating that this would be quite difficult surgery because usually with infection things become very stuck. But in fact, it was remarkably straightforward and easy. We found the perforation that was open, closed it, cleaned him up. And the second photo that we'll show is of him just 3 days after surgery. He's actually outside the hospital ward on one of the corridors, again doing his Nelson Mandela type salute. To finish with, I'd say that the procedures surgeons do is to try and heal people. I started by quoting Ambrose Paré, "I dress his wounds, but God heals him." What role God has in any of this is up to you to decide. Thank you. This is the Bentiu Hospital, okay? These are the hangars of the World Food Programme. There's no farms there, there's no shops. They're totally dependent on food being brought in. And then in the distance, you can see the camp, the POC camp. The next slide. This is the POC camp close-up. You can see the living conditions that these people are having to cope with. Extraordinary, really. Sometimes there are fires, sometimes there are fights. It's a very difficult environment for these people to be in. And I think we've got a slide of Mun somewhere. Yes, this is the reverse order. This is him. Oh, there we go. This is him at the referral centre that didn't have a surgical service, but who'd sent this picture. And this little telltale sign there, that's the bottom of his colostomy bag, showing that he still had the fistula. But you can see he's a fit and healthy boy, and there he is just in his surgical gown. This is the MSF hospital. These are the wards. That's a roof. When I first went and worked there, this was all mud and there was no roof. MSF has invested significantly in this hospital for the benefit of all the staff and, of course, for the patients. Thank you.